No one in Berlin believed it could happen, until that morning proved them wrong. March 4th, 1944, Berlin. Sirens wailed across the capital as radar screens lit up like storm clouds. More than 700 American bombers were approaching the heart of the Reich, escorted, incredibly, by a few hundred P-51 Mustangs. In just 3 hours that morning, U.S. pilots claimed 179 German fighters destroyed, 30 probably destroyed, and 90 damaged. A number so staggering that Luftwaffe intelligence refused to believe it. Fewer than 80 American aircraft failed to return, a claimed 6-to-1 ratio that shocked Germany's high command. Inside Tempelhof airfield, German pilots sprinted to their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. They knew the routine: intercept the bombers once the American escorts ran out of fuel and turned back at the border. That tactic had worked for years, keeping Germany's skies safe. But not today. As they climbed through the cold morning haze, something impossible appeared above the city. Silver Mustangs, fast, sleek, and utterly out of place, circling at 25,000 feet over Berlin itself. They weren't supposed to be there. No fighter in the world could fly 600 miles from England, fight over the capital, and still make it home. Yet there they were, the unthinkable made real. That morning, Berlin's safe sky became a graveyard of fire and silver wings. Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland later said, "The day I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." By early 1944, the Luftwaffe still believed that mathematics and geography would protect them. They had spent years studying American aircraft performance and fuel limits, calculating the invisible walls of range that guarded Germany's skies. The numbers seemed unbreakable. A P-47 Thunderbolt could fly barely 375 miles on escort duty. A P-38 Lightning, perhaps 450. From the English coast to Berlin was nearly 600 miles one way. By every law of fuel and physics, no Allied fighter could reach the German capital, fight, and return. That single fact had shaped an entire strategy. German interceptors, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, would climb to altitude, wait for the American escorts to turn back, and then fall upon the unprotected bombers. In 1943, this system worked brutally well. Daylight raids over Schweinfurt and Regensburg cost the U.S. 8th Air Force up to 10% of its bombers per mission. Crews called it the long walk home, flying back over the channel with engines bleeding oil and half their formation gone. To Berlin's defenders, the pattern seemed eternal. So long as fuel had limits, the Reich had time. But time was already running out. In a few short weeks, a new machine would cross those invisible walls, and the balance that had protected Germany since 1940 would collapse in a single morning. The aircraft that changed everything was born not in Berlin or Washington, but in a workshop in California. The P-51 Mustang began as a modest design, a lightweight frame built for the Royal Air Force. Its first model used the Allison VO-1710 engine, powerful at low altitude but gasping for air above 15,000 feet. Then British engineers proposed a daring idea: mount the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine into the American airframe. The result was a revolution. The Merlin transformed the Mustang into a high-altitude predator, fast, stable, and shockingly efficient. With two 108-gallon drop tanks beneath its wings, the P-51 could, incredibly, escort bombers for more than 750 miles. Its top speed reached 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, and its ceiling climbed beyond 42,000. 6 half-inch Browning machine guns gave it both reach and bite. German intelligence dismissed the first reports as propaganda. Their engineers insisted that such range was impossible without stripping armor or guns. But they were wrong. The Mustang kept everything: speed, firepower, protection, and added endurance no German fighter could match. When the first P-51s arrived in Europe in late 1943, they quietly began flying deeper and deeper into German airspace. Then, on that March morning in 1944, they reached Berlin itself. The impossible had arrived. At dawn on March 6, 1944, 2 days after that first encounter, the 8th Air Force launched Mission 250, the first full-scale daylight raid on Berlin. The plan was massive. Over 730 bombers, flying fortresses and liberators, would strike the capital, escorted by nearly 800 fighters, Thunderbolts, Lightnings, and about 175 Mustangs. For the first time, American bombers would carry fighter cover all the way to the German capital. The Luftwaffe responded with everything it had. More than 600 interceptors, Bf-109s, and Fw-190s from JG-11, JG-26, JG-54, and JG-300 scrambled to defend the city. Over Brandenburg, the two forces met in a sky already streaked with contrails. For 3 brutal hours, hundreds of aircraft wheeled and clashed at altitudes above 20,000 feet. The results were catastrophic for Germany. For the men on the ground, the shock was just as great. Berliners who had been told that the capital was safe watched flaming wrecks fall through the morning haze. The fortress Europe had been breached from the sky. That day, Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters, stood on a runway near Berlin and said quietly to his staff, "The day I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." As the Mustangs swept past Berlin, a new chapter of air warfare had begun, one where distance no longer meant safety. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt, but every move only made the losses worse. Their old strategy, waiting for the escorts to turn back, was now useless. German squadrons began massing hundreds of fighters for head-on attacks, hoping to break through the Mustang screen by sheer numbers. Instead, they met disciplined American formations, radar-coordinated and fuel-rich, that could stay in the fight for as long as it took. The Mustangs had one weapon more dangerous than guns: endurance. German fighters burned precious gasoline climbing to altitude, intercepting bombers far west of Berlin. Once in combat, they had only minutes, sometimes seconds, before they had to turn back or risk running dry. The P-51s, with their drop tanks and efficient Merlin engines, could loiter above the battle, dive to engage, then climb again without fear of range. When a German pilot broke off, the Mustang followed. For years, Germany had ruled the air. Now, it was drowning in it. During these months, Germany's pilot corps began to disintegrate. Veterans were dying faster than replacements could be trained. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe had already lost more than 2,260 fighter pilots, nearly 1/4 of its force in only 4 months. The new recruits arriving at the front had barely 100 flight hours. American pilots, by comparison, logged over 350 hours before ever seeing combat. Georg Peter Eder later wrote, "By mid-1944, we were sending boys against men." On the ground, bomber losses told the same story. In 1943, 8th Air Force missions averaged between 5 and 10% losses per raid. By late 1944, under Mustang escort, that figure dropped below 2%. Strategic bombing had become sustainable. The factories that fueled Germany's war machine, oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, aircraft assembly lines, were now within reach of protected bomber formations. The skies that once guaranteed German defense had become the front line of their destruction. Every new raid proved that the balance of power had permanently shifted. As the spring of 1944 unfolded, the Luftwaffe's decline turned from a setback into a collapse. Fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and relentless Allied pressure combined into a spiral that no command order could stop. Each mission drained the last reserves of experience. Each replacement unit sent into battle came home with fewer men than it left with. Before the war, a German fighter pilot averaged about 240 to 270 hours of training before combat. By early 1944, that number had fallen to less than 110, sometimes under 80. The new pilots could take off, climb, and shoot, but not survive. In contrast, the Americans trained their aviators with a luxury Germany could no longer afford: over 350 flight hours before combat, and a constant supply of fuel, instructors, and aircraft. The difference was visible in the sky. Veteran German squadrons that once dominated Europe were now shredded by Mustangs before they could even reach the bombers. On the ground, commanders watched their strength evaporate day by day. By May 1944, one more weakness would cripple the Luftwaffe completely: the loss of fuel itself. The Allied bombing campaign had begun targeting Germany's industrial heart with mathematical precision. With the Mustang now able to escort bombers anywhere, no factory or refinery lay beyond reach. The most devastating blows came not from the bombs themselves, but from what they took away: fuel. In May, American bombers struck the synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Pölitz, Berlin, and Brooks. Each facility was a vital artery in Germany's war economy. Within months, production of aviation gasoline plummeted from 180,000 tons per month to less than 30,000, an 85% collapse. Every part of the Luftwaffe began to suffocate. Training flights were canceled. Entire squadrons were grounded. Experienced pilots could not fly enough to stay sharp. New pilots were sent into combat with barely any hours. Even when the Luftwaffe managed to scramble interceptors, they often had to break off fights simply because their tanks were nearly empty. Meanwhile, the P-51s, with their drop tanks and fuel-efficient Merlins, could linger over Germany for hours, patient, methodical, and merciless. By late summer, the consequences were irreversible. The 8th Air Force suffered less than 2% bomber losses per mission, while German aircraft fell in the hundreds. Strategic targets, oil, ball bearings, aircraft plants, were systematically erased. Without fuel, without training, without time, the Luftwaffe ceased to function as an air defense force. The last hope rested on the Me-262 jet fighter, a technological marvel capable of 540 miles per hour, faster than any piston-engine plane in the world. On paper, it could have changed everything. In the sky, it changed nothing. There were too few, too late, and they were chained to vulnerable airfields. Allied bombers, escorted always by Mustangs, destroyed the runways before the jets could even take off. Those that managed to climb into the sunlight were hunted before they could even fire a shot. By the fall of 1944, the once proud Luftwaffe had become a shadow of itself, an air force in name only. The skies over Germany, once its shield, had become the instrument of its ruin, and the fighter that made it possible was still circling overhead, silver, patient, and relentless: the P-51 Mustang. By the end of that year, the Luftwaffe was no longer a force. It was a memory. In just 12 months, more than 13,000 German fighter pilots had been killed or declared missing. The veterans who had once swept across Europe in triumph were gone, replaced by cadets barely old enough to shave. Of the elite Jagdgeschwader units that had defended the Reich, fewer than 1/3 could field a full squadron. The skies above Germany told the story more clearly than any report ever could. Every morning, the roar of hundreds of B-17s and B-24s echoed across the countryside. Above them, the Mustangs wheeled like guardian hawks, waiting for any German fighter desperate enough to rise. Those who did rarely came back. The Me-262 brought only a flicker of hope. It was faster than anything on Earth, reaching 870 kilometers per hour and capable of slicing through bomber formations before the escorts could react. But the jets' promise was crushed by reality. There were too few, too late, and they were trapped on airfields already marked for destruction. The Mustangs simply waited above the runways, ambushing the jets as they took off or landed. By December, Germany's skies were no longer battlefields. They were corridors for Allied bombers. The Reich's factories lay in ruins, its oil supply in ashes, its pilots buried or captured. Berliners looked up not in pride, but in silence, watching silver streams cross their sky unopposed. What began as a promise of invincibility in 1939 had ended as a quiet surrender in the clouds. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, had died above its own cities. Before the Mustang, air war had one iron rule: bombers could never be protected all the way to their targets. Distance meant safety. Range meant survival. That belief ended on March 4th, 1944, when the first Mustangs appeared over Berlin. The Mustang redefined air warfare. It wasn't the fastest or the most agile, but it could do everything well enough and reach everywhere. Its balance of speed, firepower, endurance, and reliability gave the Allies something no nation had ever achieved before: true air superiority across an entire continent. By early 1945, America's 8th Air Force was flying daily missions deep into Germany with losses under 2%. Strategic bombing, once unsustainable, became relentless. Refineries, factories, and transport hubs all fell under the protection of the Mustang's wings. When the war ended on May 8, 1945, the Luftwaffe existed only on paper. Adolf Galland, the man who had built Germany's fighter corps, later wrote, "The Mustang was the best fighter of the war, not because it was the fastest, but because it could reach anywhere and stay there." Berlin had once believed that distance would protect it. The Mustang proved that no distance was safe, no border too far, no sky beyond reach. That morning in 1944, when silver fighters appeared over the German capital, the war for the skies was decided. It was the day the impossible became reality. The day the sky over Berlin betrayed Germany. The sky that once guarded an empire became the sky that buried it. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, subscribe to Fireline. Here, history flies again. One story, one battle, one hero at a time.